Hey, it's Mr. Ring going over the Precalc Chapter 4B test, April 5th, 2019, version A. Compared to the graph of y equals cosine x, the horizontal shift of y equals cosine 1/4 x plus pi over 32. Here you need an a value. Sorry, there should be a b value. And to do that, you'll have to factor out here. So what's the greatest common factor? The answer is 1/4. So 1/4 times x gives you 1/4 x. 1/4 times pi over 8 is 1 over 32. Remember, another way of doing that is something like this. 1/4 times that box is going to equal 1 over 32. And then if you multiply both sides by 4, you'll get the box is equal to 1/8 or pi over 8. Remember, the formula has a minus sign, so I changed the plus sign to minus minus. Therefore, c is negative pi over 8, which basically means when your c is a negative value, that means you're going to the left pi over 8. So the answer is choice A. Remember, it's 9 points or 0. Question number 2, find the value of tangent of the inverse of negative radical 3 alpha. Well, you don't have an alpha, so set an x equal to a variable. Like I did here. And you're going to switch them. That's what the inverse tells you. So tangent alpha equals negative radical 3. Tangent is negative in quadrants 1 and 3. Tangent, as you remember, is y over x. So in some ways, you need an x value that's 1 and a y value that's radical 3, negative. That would be at this position at 4 pi over 6. And this would be 9, and this would be at this position, number 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, so 1 comma radical 3, that's y over x, which would give you tangent of this angle at is radical 3 over 1, so this would be 10 pi over 6, or essentially 5 pi over 3. Remember, you're taking the inverse of tangent, so your new restricted domain, where your new range is between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. To find a common denominator, and multiply it by 3, so you get negative 3 pi over 6 and 3 pi over 6. Notice how these two values, if I double them, I get 4 pi over 6 and 10 pi over 6. Notice those are not in my restricted domain, so those are both rejected. If I find a coterminal angle, negative 12, subtract 12 pi over 6 gives you negative 8 pi over 6 and negative 2 pi over 6. This again is too big, but this one works. So essentially, 5 pi over 3 works. Now, none of these are 5 pi over 3 because my answer has to be between here. So essentially, negative 2 pi over 6, if you reduce, gives you negative pi over 3, which means choice C. Which statement is incorrect for the graph of y equals negative 3 cosine pi over 3 x minus 4 plus 7? Showing you the solution. So I just graphed the problem and then I compared it. So here are my A, B, C's, and D's. My period is 6. So this problem says the period is 6. That would be choice number 1, and that's true. Remember, the period is when the graph starts and when it ends. So number 1 I put here is true, check mark. Amplitude, if you graph this, the amplitude is the absolute value of A, which means that's 3, which is true. And on the graph, remember, the amplitude is the maximum or the minimum. So you could have gone this direction to the maximum, this direction to the minimum, and this is your amplitude, not both. Question number 3, choice 3 says the range. Remember, the range is the y-axis. You're starting at 4, ending at 10. So your range is 4 to 10 is correct, and D is incorrect. The midline is the midpoint between the maximum and the minimum. So I have 10 plus 4 is 2, 14 divided by 2 is 7, and you can clearly see that 7 is the midline there, not negative 4. So for question number 3, which one is wrong or incorrect? That's choice 4. Question number 4, what is the value of tangent, arc, cosine, radical 2 over 2? Remember, I'm setting this one here equal to a letter, so I chose alpha. Alpha equals arc cosine radical 2. Arc just basically means to switch. So if I switch the alpha and the radical 2, cosine of alpha equals radical 2 over 2. Remember here I can cosine is easiest in quadrant 1. You can use y over r. I'm sorry, cosine is x over r. So with an x value of radical 2 and an r value of 2, you'll recognize that this is a 45, 45, 90 triangle, and these two sides are the same. You can use the Pythagorean Theorem to figure out that this side is radical 2, and then tangent would be y over x, so radical 2 over 2 would be 1. Remember, where is tangent? Tangent there would just be, another way of thinking about it is thinking of a circle. All students take calculus. Where is cosine positive? That would be in these two quadrants at these locations. And then tangent at those numbers, again, would be, the order pairs are radical 2 over 2, so that would be y over x, which would be 1. And down here it's negative radical 2 over negative radical 2. And that would give you positive 1. Question number 5, Ken. That one's wrong. Should use pencil. Using numbers 1 to 5, it's either 6 points or 1, and here's your correct solution, and that side is out of 40. Let's turn to the back side. Okay, what I did is these questions are normally out of 4 points, and then I made a scale, so 1 point is essentially 7.5. So if I normally score you a 4 points correct, then you would get 30, 3 points 22, 2 points 15, 1 point 7.5. Tangent of arc sine x, I made this set equal to alpha. Remember, arc is the same thing as the inverse, so essentially all you have to do is just switch these. Sine of alpha, sine of an angle equals x. Now this is kind of weird, so I made a fraction x over 1, and then sine is y over r. So on my picture, here's my y value. I called it the variable x. The x-axis, or if you want to call it like maybe 3 sides of a triangle, like this is a, the a side is x. Your b value you have to figure out, and your r value is 1. Your c value is 1. So if you use the Pythagorean Theorem, a would be x squared, your b value is unknown, and c is 1, so that becomes 1, x squared is x squared. Subtract, and then you take the square root of both sides. b is equal to plus or minus 1 minus x squared. You notice that b is in quadrant 1, so that would be a plus. And then what is tangent? Tangent is the opposite side over the adjacent. So alpha's there. So opposite over the adjacent would be x over 1 minus x squared. I need to rationalize the denominator, so just basically take that and multiply by itself. Here, when you multiply, you have 2 of these expressions, so basically you just have what's left in the argument, so 1 minus x squared, and this is just x times 1 minus x squared. So to get full credit, you get all 4 here. 3 points if you got at least 1 square root of 1 minus x squared, and 2 points if you have this equation, sine of alpha equals x. Question number 9. It's kind of messy. Hopefully I can clean that up. Here you're graphing sine, and then we graph what's above it. That's the big picture idea. I'm graphing sine, and then basically the bumps are what I'm finding. So I change that into sine, and then I factor out the 3, so I get negative 2 minus sine 3 times x minus negative pi over 12. A value is negative 1, so the graph's going to be flipped. B value is 3. That helps me find my period. 2 pi over b. which means that my period is 2 pi over 3. My C value here, again, 3 times a box equals pi over 4. Divided by 3 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/3, so the box is pi over 12. So you're going to go left because it's negative and down 2. Remember, because you have these parentheses, you're going to have to do a shift, so we're going to put this between 0 and 2 pi. A lot of students divided by 3 here. That would be incorrect. You are subtracting pi over 4. This becomes 8 pi over 4, so that's 7 pi over 4, and this is negative pi over 4. Dividing by 3 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/3, so this becomes 7 pi over 12 and negative pi over 12. These two values right here is my 2 starting points. Kind of messy. So 1 plus 7, that's a negative 1. Negative 1 plus 7 gives you 6, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. So the distance between 3 and 7 is 4, and this is a distance of 4. 3 plus 7 is 10, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. Negative 1 plus 3 is 4, and 4 divided by 2 is 3 plus negative 1 is 2, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. So negative 1, 1, and 3. The first thing you do is you multiply by 3 here. So 3 times this number gives you negative 3 pi over 12, which reduces to negative pi over 4. 3 times pi over 12 gives you 3 pi over 12 or pi over 4, and 3 times 3 pi over 12 is 9 pi over 12, which is 3 pi over 4, and 3 times 5 pi over 12 is 15 pi over 12, and 15 pi over 12 reduces to 5 pi over 4, and 3 times 7 pi over 12, I'm just multiplying the numerators there, so that's 21 pi over 12, which reduces to 7 pi over 4. Then you're going to add pi over 4 to each of those, so this becomes 0, that becomes 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2, this becomes 4 pi over 4, which is pi, and that becomes 6 pi over 4, which is 3 pi over 2, and then 8 pi over 4, which is 2 pi. And then you're going to take that value, and remember, you're finding the sign. And then this is my golden row, so that's just 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0 for my quadrantal angles of the unit circle. And then you're going to multiply by negative 1. Remember, in some ways you're going from the right to the left. It's essentially order of operations. Multiply that number by negative 1. And then here you're going to add negative 2. So if you take those values, negative pi over 12 and then negative 2. Pi over 12 is negative 3. Pi over 4 is at negative 2. 5 pi over 12 is at negative 1. And then 7 pi over 12 is negative 2. And then, so this is my graph of sine. And what you're doing here is then, at the x-axis, these were the x-intercepts. That's where you're drawing your asymptotes. And then you're going to draw above, below, and above the bumps, your graph. This one was graded out of 6 points, 1 point for the letters, 1 point for the x-intercept, 1 point for the shape, 1 point for accuracy, 1 point for the table, 1 point for the period. Essentially, there's going to be 6 points for every one of those accurately. Remember, a shorter way of doing this is just taking those 5 x values that you found up here and then just substituting them in. Let me show you why it's a asymptote. Let's choose pi over 4. 3 times pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4, and 3 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 4 pi over 4, which is pi. So cosecant at pi, here's pi, cosecant is r over y, so that's 1 divided by 0, which is undefined. Undefined times negative 1 is undefined, and undefined added to negative 2 is still undefined. So this is a shorter way of doing the table. Shows you where those asymptotes are. So again, 6 points for one of those, and it's possible we got none of them correct, it would have been 0. And then that side plus this side gives you, should be at 110. Let's check that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 36 plus 6 plus 2. So 42, 44 for that side. Huh? Does that make sense? 44. And then this side was 36 plus, that gives you 66. So then 66 plus 44 gives you, so it's possible that you could have scored a maximum of 110 points, but then it was only out of, in areas I'm only putting it out of 100. So hopefully that was helpful for you. Corrections. Good luck.